We are still doing chapter 4. If we were to go back, just to remind you, we're in chapter 4, Infancy, Early Learning, Motor Skills, and Perceptual Capacities. So we talked about reflexes. We talked about why investigation of infants' abilities has been such an interesting hot topic in the past 30 years. We talked about sleep. We talked about crying. And now we are going to talk about how infants learn. Now, infants learn through 4 different ways. Some of these you remember from your previous cognitive courses, classical conditioning, for example, operant conditioning. But also, infants have a natural preference for novel stimulation, which allows researchers to actually understand what infants recognize as being novel or different, and also their social learning and imitation. Now, these all also develop, and now we're going to talk about them. So the first is classical conditioning, and probably you know this very well, right? So you have an unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned response. So these are usually of infants or organisms' basic needs, right? So in this case, this is, for example, about food, nurture. And so here, we see that the infant, when they encounter the breast, they start sucking, and these two are paired. So the idea is that this is a natural pairing, correct? We want to introduce a natural stimulus, in this case, for example, stroking the forehead of the infant, and to get that to be paired with the unconditioned response. And if you do this, over time, you can actually get it. In the last picture here, you see the woman isn't actually nursing the baby, but just stroking his head, and the baby is sucking, right? So those get paired. So this is one way for the infant. So this is one tool for the infant to learn, but it's not the only way. There's also operant conditioning. Operant conditioning, as you know, uses reinforcers and punishment. And this time, you are working with kind of novel stimuli that gets paired. A reinforcer increases the probability of the behavior occurring again, and the punishment reduces the probability of behavior occurring again. This could be in the shape of presenting an unpleasant stimulus or removing a desirable stimulus. Now, operant conditioning gives us clues. How do they actually look at operant conditioning, whether babies learn through operant conditioning? There have been studies made. You know those mobiles that hang over babies' cribs? They have like little shapes attached to them. They dangle, right? So what they did is they basically pulled a string, tied a string to the mobile. So one end is tied to the mobile. The other end is tied to the baby's foot. Will the baby understand that when they kick, the mobile moves, right? Will they start associating these two? And it seems like babies are actually pretty good at this. Starting with 2 months, babies can associate these two, so they understand. They don't really understand the mechanics of how the string pulls on the mobile, but they understand that if they kick, the mobile will move. Yeah, and interestingly enough, they can retain this knowledge over longer time. For example, at 3 months, they can retain the knowledge for 1 to 2 days. So if you present the same mobile 2 days later, a 3-month-old might start kicking again spontaneously because they remember that if they kicked, the mobile moved. Interestingly, by 6 months, they can actually remember it for 2 weeks. And at 18 months, babies can retain the knowledge for up to 13 weeks. If given reminders intermittently, this period gets longer. So it's also giving us an insight into memory development, correct? And so at first, when babies learn, context is important. Meaning, it has to be the same mobile, right? Because it doesn't work when you change aspects of the context. But as babies become older, what happens is that learning becomes less context dependent or more context free. It's around 1 year. So which means that they can transfer what they learned to similar stimuli. Again, this is generalizing or transferring knowledge is a very important tool that all of you guys have, right? So in any case, when you learn something, even as a kid, when you learned how to add, for example, you might have learned adding with limited numbers, for example, 1 to 10. But then once you understood the principle behind adding, then it didn't matter what you were adding, which two numbers you were adding, you could perform the operation. And so that's when learning actually becomes learning. It can be transferred to new novel stimuli. And we see this flexibility in babies as they get older. Do please look at your book for operant conditioning, at least in my edition here, and I have the 9th edition. I can tell you that it is on page 141. Please pay attention to figure 4.3. Yeah, write it somewhere that you will see when you're studying for the exam. 4.3. It's page 141. I can't hear you. Well, they should be bringing it, yes. If by the time you're studying for the exam, you still don't have the book, stop by the TA's office to read the page. And so it's figure 4.3. Do read the whole operant conditioning section. It's 1 page, 141, 142. How do we know about the fact that babies are curious about new things? Well, there are very cool studies that look at that too. For example, they put a pacifier, emzik, into the infant's mouth, right? And as they suck, they hear a noise or voices or music, like there's variations of these studies. They suck harder to hear more interesting sounds or sounds that they find more interesting or to see more interesting things. So they basically pair sucking with the new stimulus, for example. We know that, for example, they suck harder to hear their mother's voice. Yes. And so another way through which, and using this infant's curiosity for new things, there's a paradigm called the habituation, sometimes looking time paradigm. I mean, you now all know that babies are very tough to investigate because they can tell us very little, right? So we have to find smart ways of understanding what they know or what they recognize through what the babies can do. So they can suck, so we use the pacifier, for example. Another thing that they can do is look. And so we look at their looking times to understand their interest levels. Okay? And so in habituation paradigms, what they do, habituation in Turkish would be alıştırmak. Okay? In habituation paradigms, what they do is they use infant's preference for novelty to study their attention, memory, and knowledge. Habituation in English would be the gradual reduction in the strength of a response to repetitive stimulation. So it's basically getting bored of a stimulus, okay? So they show the baby a stimulus like this, for example. If I can get my pointer, it's going to become easier. So they show this, for example. They show it long enough that the baby becomes bored, habituated. So what do you do when you're bored? You look at other things. As you guys all know, when you are bored in class, you look at your phone. You shouldn't, by the way. I am not condoning the practice, just because I'm recognizing it here verbally. You may look at the slides from your other class, right? You might start drawing pictures. You do something else, which tells us you are bored. In the baby's case, they keep looking at interesting stimuli. Once the stimuli becomes old or non-interesting, they divert their gaze. Okay. And so at that point, what researchers do is they introduce now a different stimulus. And they try to see whether, if it's a preferential looking paradigm, then we're trying to figure out whether the infant will choose to look at one thing over another, right? And so what it is we're trying to see if the infant's interest is renewed. If they start looking longer at this is new. See, these are both very similar. This is an old man, this is a baby. Okay, maybe it's not clearly visible from where you're sitting, but this is a baby's head, this is a baby's head, this is an old man's head, okay? And so this is new. So the infant, if the infant recognizes the difference between these two faces, we expect that the infant will start looking. All of a sudden, they will start attending. Okay? And that's usually what happens. So in the immediate test phase, they show a novelty. This is called a novelty preference. They choose to look at the new thing. Okay? In the delayed test phase, though, something else happens. When you again present two stimulus, they will go back and start looking at the familiar one. Because they are like, I remember this from before. It was interesting before. Let me start looking at it a little bit more. This is called familiarity preference. So in the immediate test phase, you have novelty preference. The infant chooses to look or prefers to look at the new thing because they're already bored, right? If you put a delay between the first presentation and habituation and later new stimulus, when they see something familiar, they'll start attending to the familiar after a delay. Go ahead, Banu.
One of them are similar because you can show the novelty preference, so he showed both of them. So he's familiar with both of the cases.
This doesn't have to, I'm sorry, this is in one graph, but this does not have to be in one experiment. Okay? Just to show you what, forget about this when you're looking at this, okay? Yes, you are right. Both of them will have become familiar if they habituated to the same thing. The graph might be a little bit misleading, right? But what it is basically they are going to choose the same. If this was shown the first time, right, after a delay, they're going to show familiarity preference, which is.
But then why don't they show the novelty preference? If they show the habituation phase, then they are going to see the one and the bottom.
If there's a delay, enough delay, then what it is they recognize what they have seen before. Yes. And so, novelty preference, familiarity preference, and this way, just by looking at where the babies are looking, you are able to tell what? You're able to tell whether they recognize that something is different. It tells you that. It tells you that much. Now, some of these habituation experiments have been criticized a lot, and we are going to talk more about them in Chapter 6 when we're talking about early cognitive development, because interpreting the findings is a little bit tricky, right? So all we know is that infants look longer or look less. But what does it mean for what the infant knows is a different issue. Okay. And here's a graph, for example. So what it's telling you is the green line is the control group, the one that goes down like this. And so you introduce a stimulus, and as soon as you introduce the stimulus, the infant will start looking more. And if you keep the same stimulus up for the infant's looking time will decrease because they're getting bored, right, over time looking at the same thing. Okay, so here what you have is the infant is basically shown the stimulus. I'm looking at the blue line now, right? And they're habituated, right? But if they're shown a different stimuli this time, this is called dishabituation because they all of a sudden get interested again, right? Their interest peaks again. And so that is what we are using. So right at this point, we're basically showing either two similar stimuli or a different stimuli or the same stimuli to see infants' habituation and their rates of dishabituation. Yes. This one is less confusing, and this one actually does not commit the error that Banu just showed with the other picture. So what we have here is infant looking at actions. We know, and we're going to talk about this in the next coming class a little bit more, that infants like looking at action. They're interested in moving things, okay? And more than still images. Now here, in the habituation phase, they are shown this woman brushing her teeth, right? In the immediate test phase, this time they have the woman who's brushing her teeth, but they have also a different woman who's brushing her hair. The actions are very similar, right? It's basically the actions are very similar, but they are not identical. And in the immediate test phase, what do you see? You see that the infant attends more to the novel stimulus, novelty preference, okay? So after a delay, here it says 7 weeks later, this baby this time is shown both the old stimulus, here we see, the same woman brushing teeth, versus, again, here, a brushing hair. If they were originally habituated to this one, if this was their original habituation, so they looked at this longer, they saw it longer, then they're going to show what? This preference for the one that is more familiar, because they were originally habituated to this one, right? They saw it more. Okay, so this opens a window to the infant's minds. Infants are, as I said, naturally interested, for example, in actions. They seem to have longer memory for actions than faces, for example. There are both pros and cons to these paradigms. So in habituation, we could ask, is the infant's learning context dependent? Seems less so as compared to what operant conditioning studies would have us believe, because we can see that infants get habituated more flexibly than the operant conditioning would let us believe, so at earlier ages. But it is very difficult to interpret. At the end of the day, all we have is the infant looking more or looking less. And don't think about infants looking like you're looking. It is not as continuous. You know, when you study, for example, if you're studying for an exam and you're looking at a graph, I think that you look at that graph in an uninterrupted manner for a period of time to study it in detail. Let's look at a video here to get an understanding of what these studies may look like. And so as you could see, though the children that were tested were a little bit older than 3 months, 6 months. They were at least a year old. We could see that the ones that used the touch screen actually had a good grasp of their arm movements, and that they pointing, for example, had already developed. So the ones that she seems to have on the videotape are about 1 year of age and older. If infants are younger, obviously we can't use active kinds of measures like touch screens and stuff, but we are relying on either more brain scanning type measures or looking time. Okay. Interestingly, the rate with which a baby habituates and dishabituates seems to correlate with later intelligence. There's small to modest power, yes. So because it means that the infant is processing, right? For them to habituate to something means that they have processed it fast enough. And when this habituation occurs, it means that the infant recognizes that the new stimuli is actually not the same as the previous stimuli faster. So that's probably why we have this relation between both rate of habituation and rate of dishabituation and later intelligence. We see that shorter lookers are at an advantage here. The longer lookers, the ones who actually get stuck looking at stimuli longer, means that they probably aren't attending to the whole of what they are seeing, but they're kind of getting lost in details. They're paying too much attention to the details such that they're not processing the whole image. And there are studies, for example, where they redirect infants' attention through using a pointer like this, so that the infant pays attention to the whole figure rather than aspects of it. And it seems to actually work. they then have lower habituation or, yes, shorter habituation times and shorter dishabituation times. Let's come to imitation. Now, can newborns imitate? They actually do. They can't imitate obviously, an infant has a lot of physical constraints. They can't move like an adult can. But what they can do is they can move their face, right? And so imitation has been studied mostly with very young newborns, for example. Has been studied mostly with facial expressions. Some suggest that this is a reflex. Others aren't sure. And so some suggest it's a reflex because as babies get older, they actually imitate less of facial expressions. And so, and there's also controversy. There are studies that have been able to replicate results. There are studies that have not been able to replicate results. But let me show you what I mean by facial imitation.
Hello.
Only 10 minutes old, Xavier's infant senses are bombarded with new sights, sounds, and feelings.
Good boy.
He watches his father pull faces and then slowly responds. This isn't conscious mimicry. Xavier doesn't even know he has a face. But he's managing to translate what he sees into similar actions of his own.
Hello. You copy Daddy.
It looks pretty amazing because this is really a newborn that's born in the last few hours and is, yes?
Do they only imitate their parents or?
No, they can imitate other people too. Actually, here is Dr. Meltzoff, who successfully recorded infants' facial imitation with newborns. And you can see him in action here in the lab. This is from a 1977 publication. So obviously, Dr. Meltzoff is older now, and we have a little interview with him too that we're going to watch. But his paper was the first. It's Meltzoff and Moore, 1977. That I'm hoping that it's not 79, but I think it's 77. That actually drew attention to the fact that newborns could imitate. But what does it mean? Why is it so interesting if newborns can imitate facial expressions? Newborns won't recognize themselves in the mirror. They actually have very little knowledge of their body, right? Of what belongs to them, what doesn't belong to them. And so it is quite interesting that they will mimic these actions. Some researchers have said that they are born with a sense of identifying others as like me, and hence understand their movements and copy them. Others are more doubtful. This is not, don't take this as a fact. This is still being debated on as to when infants or even young children, toddlers, actually understand that others are like me. And to what extent? Banu?
Can it be due to
Survival
survival instincts?
instincts. That would certainly be a convenient explanation. Some have suggested that it has to do with mirror neurons. The thing is, though, mirror neurons also go through substantial development throughout early childhood. So when a baby is born, mirror neurons are not functioning at the level that an older child or an adult's mirror neurons would function. It certainly could come in handy, but more research needs to be done, I think. The fact that it disappears later on is what is quite confusing again. Because if it were a like me kind of understanding, you'd expect it to stick around, right? And what use is it for the infant in the first 3 months of life if it's a reflex for survival? it is not often that they have to look at other babies to learn how to suck, for example. Mothers don't usually try to elicit sucking by moving their own mouths. They're not yet producing sounds like the sounds that parents produce. So we have to think about this a little bit more. But interestingly enough, monkeys also do imitate. So one wonders if it's just special to human beings. Would that have survival value for the monkeys? Right? And there we come to sequence of motor development. It goes on for another 10, 15 slides, and I only have 5 minutes, so I'm going to stop here in order for the topic not to be cut in the middle. I'm going to see you on Wednesday at 10:40. Thank you.